I never thought I'd be the person standing in a kitchen at 3 a.m, staring at a bank statement with millions of dollars in it, crying because we were too poor to spend time together. It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Having a fortune at your fingertips, but feeling like you're losing everything that actually matters. My husband was a vice president of engineering, a Stanford graduate, a man whose brain was worth more than most small companies. And yet, there he was, hunched over his laptop in the dim glow of the monitor, his eyes bloodshot, trying to figure out how to pay for another round of dialysis and private nursing, while a literal king's ransom sat untouched in my savings account. He was killing himself to protect a future that I didn't even want if he wasn't in it. It was a slow-motion car crash of pride, love, and a ticking clock that none of us could stop. The story really begins 4.5 years ago. That was the day the world shifted on its axis for us. My mother-in-law, a vibrant, fierce woman who had raised my husband on her own, suffered a spinal cord stroke. In an instant, she went from an independent 80-year-old to being completely paralyzed. Quadriplegia. It's a word that sounds clinical until you see it in person, until you see someone you love trapped in a body that no longer obeys a single command. For the last 4.5 years, our lives have been measured in 4-hour increments. Monday through Friday, she stays in a private nursing home. It's expensive, exorbitantly so, but it's a good place. However, the weekends were sacred. Every Saturday morning, my husband would go get her. He'd bring her to our home, and for 48 hours, he wasn't a high-level engineer or a husband. He was a full-time, round-the-clock caregiver. If you've never cared for someone with quadriplegia, you can't imagine the physical and emotional toll. He did everything. And when I say everything, I mean the things that most people turn away from. He was the one who changed her diapers, cleaning her with a tenderness that would break your heart. He was the one who spoon-fed her every single meal, hovering the spoon and waiting for her to chew, then offering a straw for a sip of water. She couldn't move her arms or her legs. She was a passenger in her own skin, and he was her entire world. Every 2 hours, like clockwork, he would be there, rubbing her feet, her arms, her hands. He had to keep the circulation going so her skin wouldn't break down, so her muscles wouldn't atrophy even further. He would lift her, this 82-year-old woman, out of the bed and into her wheelchair, then back again. He never complained, not once. He used to tell me, "Money can be made again, honey. My Stanford degrees aren't going anywhere. But I only have one mother." I admired him for it. I loved him for it. But as the years ticked by, the strain started to show. Her health wasn't getting better. At 82, the body doesn't bounce back. It just finds new ways to fail. The specialist costs started piling up. Out-of-pocket hospital bills that looked like phone numbers. Treatments that weren't covered by insurance. The financial weight was becoming a mountain. Then came January 2026. My husband was offered the role of executive management, vice president of engineering. It came with a massive salary, the kind of money that should have solved all our problems. But there was a catch. The job was all-consuming. It wasn't a 9-to-5. It was a 24/7 commitment to the company. Suddenly, the weekends he spent caring for his mother were gone. He couldn't do it anymore. He had to hire nurses to take her to dialysis 4 times a week because he was stuck in boardrooms or on flights. He had to keep her at the private facility on weekends too, because he was too exhausted to provide the level of care she needed. He took the job for one reason, the money. He needed it to pay for her declining health. He told me he was doing it to protect me. You see, I have an inheritance. My father was a very successful businessman in Shanghai, and when he passed, he left me enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and then some. I offered it to my husband immediately. I told him, take it, pay for your mum's care, quit this job that's killing you, spend the time you have left with her. But he refused. He looked me in the eyes with shadows under his own that looked like bruises and said, "That money is for your future. If anything happens to me, I need to know you're okay. I won't touch a penny of it for my mother's medical bills. That's my responsibility." It felt like a slap in the face, though I knew he meant it as a gesture of love. He was throwing himself into a meat grinder of work, sacrificing his final moments with his dying mother, just to protect a bank balance for a future that felt increasingly bleak. I tried to explain it to him. I told him, there is no future if that future is without you, if he worked himself into an early grave, or if he missed the chance to say goodbye to his mother because he was too busy earning money I already had. What was the point? We started bickering. It was the most absurd argument two people could have. I was begging him to take my millions so he could stop working, and he was stubbornly insisting on earning every cent himself while his mother's time on this earth dwindled. She's 82. She's not going to outlast the inheritance my father left me. We both knew it, but he wouldn't admit it. The atmosphere in our house changed. It used to be filled with the quiet rhythm of caregiving, the sound of the wheelchair, the soft murmurs of him talking to his mum while he fed her. Now, it was filled with the silence of an empty house and the frantic tapping of a keyboard. He was missing her life to pay for her survival. I watched him come home at 10 p.m, looking like a ghost of the man I married. He'd check his phone for updates from the nursing home, his face etched with guilt. I knew he hated that he wasn't there to change her or rub her hands. I knew he hated that a stranger was the one feeding her. And yet, the next morning, he'd put on his suit and do it all over again. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to make him see that he was trading something priceless, time, for something we already had in abundance. I told him he needed to quit. I told him he needed to be a son again, not a vice president. But he wouldn't budge. He was trapped in this provider mindset, a martyr to a cause that didn't need a sacrifice. It eventually came down to an ultimatum. I realized that if I didn't force his hand, he would keep going until either he or his mother broke. I had to do something drastic to make him realize that my inheritance wasn't just a safety net for some hypothetical future. It was the key to our present. It was the only way to buy back the time we were losing. The silence in our house on Saturdays became deafening. For 4.5 years, that silence had been filled with the sounds of life. Laboured life, sure, but life nonetheless. I used to wake up to the sound of the blender whirring as my husband prepared a specialised smoothie for his mother, or the soft, rhythmic thump, thump of him patting her back to clear her lungs. I'd hear him talking to her, telling her about his week, his projects at work, or just the weather, even if she couldn't always find the words to respond. It was a symphony of devotion. But after he took that vice president role in January, the weekends turned cold. The house felt like a museum. Everything was perfectly in place because no one was home to mess it up. He was at the office, or he was logged into a secure server from our home office, his face illuminated by the blue light of 3 different monitors. His mother was across town in the private nursing facility. I'd go visit her, and the look in her eyes, it haunted me. She didn't understand why the hands that had lifted her for nearly 5 years were suddenly replaced by the professional, yet sterile touch of a rotating shift of nurses. She looked for him every time the door opened, and every time it was just me, or a technician coming to check her vitals. A little bit of that light in her eyes flickered out. I would sit by her bed and hold her hand, the hand my husband used to rub for hours to keep her blood flowing. I'd try to do it myself, but I'm small, and I don't have his strength or his practice technique. I felt like a poor substitute. I'd tell her, "He's working, Mum. He's working for you." But at 82, with a body that's failing and a mind that's tired, working doesn't mean much. Presence means everything. When my husband would finally crawl into bed at 1 a.m., I could feel the tension radiating off him. He wasn't just tired, he was vibrating with stress. I'd try to rub his shoulders, but his muscles were like granite. "You missed her dialysis update today," I whispered one night, the moonlight cutting across our duvet. "The doctor said her kidney function is dipping again. They want to try a new specialist, but it's not covered by the plan." He didn't even open his eyes. He just let out a long, ragged sigh. "I know. I saw the email. That's why I stayed late to finish the Q1 projections. The bonus from this quarter will cover the specialist. I just need to push through." "We don't need a bonus," I said, my voice rising with a frustration I couldn't suppress anymore. "We have the money. My father left me more than we could spend in 3 lifetimes. Just use it, pay the specialist, quit the VP role, and go back to being a senior engineer. Go back to being her son." He finally opened his eyes then, and the look he gave me wasn't one of anger, but of a deep, stubborn pride that I was starting to hate. "Your father worked his whole life in Shanghai to build that legacy for you. He didn't build it to bail out my mother's medical bills. That money is your security. It's the 'if I die' money. It's the 'if the world ends' money. I am the provider of this house. If I can't pay for my own mother's care, then what kind of man am I?" "A present one," I snapped. "You'd be a present man. Do you think she cares about the legacy of a Shanghai businessman she met 3 times? She wants her son. She wants you to be the one feeding her that terrible-smelling soup she likes. She wants you to be the one who knows exactly how to tuck the blanket so her toes don't get cold. You're trading her final months for a bank balance I already have." He turned away from me, pulling the covers up. "I'm doing this for us, for your future. End of story." But it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a cold war in our marriage. Every bill that arrived became a battleground. Each time he'd show me a receipt for a $5,000 treatment, he'd look at it with a grim sense of accomplishment, like a soldier showing off a wound. He was proud of the struggle. He was proud that he was earning her survival. Meanwhile, I was watching him deteriorate. He was losing weight. His hair, which had been thick and dark, was suddenly shot through with streaks of silver. He was only in his late 40s, but he was starting to look like he was catching up to his mother's age. The irony was suffocating. He was working to pay for her health, while he threw his own into a furnace. I started talking to my father's old business associates back in Shanghai. I needed perspective. I told one of them, a man who had known my father for 40 years, about the situation. He laughed, a dry, papery sound over the phone. "Your father didn't leave you that money to keep it in a box, child. He left it to give you a life. If that money can buy your husband's soul back from a job he hates and give an old woman peace in her final days, then that is exactly what it's for. Money is just paper until it's used to change a life." I took that to heart. I realized that my husband's honor was actually a form of selfishness. He was so obsessed with being the hero who provided for everyone that he was ignoring the actual needs of the people he was providing for. His mother didn't need a VP of engineering. She needed the boy she raised. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I got a call from the nursing home. His mother had a respiratory infection, common for someone in her condition, but at 82 and paralyzed, common things are dangerous. I called him immediately. "She's in the infirmary," I told him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "They have her on oxygen. You need to come." "I have a board meeting in 20 minutes, he said, and I could hear the sound of papers shuffling in the background. I can't leave. If I miss this, the CEO will lose it. Is she stable?" "She's 82 and paralyzed, honey. Nothing is stable." I was shouting now, standing in the middle of the nursing home hallway, ignoring the looks from the staff. "She's asking for you. She can barely whisper, but she's saying your name." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, fast, shallow, panicked. He was torn. He was a man pulled in two directions by a rope made of his own making. I'll try to get away early, he finally said. He didn't show up until 8 p.m. By then the fever had broken, but she was asleep when he finally walked into the room, still wearing his expensive suit, his silk tie loosened. He looked at her, lying there under the thin hospital sheets, and he looked like he wanted to collapse. He went to take her hand, to rub it like he used to, but he hesitated. He didn't know where the IV lines were. He didn't know the new routine. He was an outsider in his own mother's care. He stayed for 30 minutes, then his phone started buzzing. An emergency at the plant. He looked at the phone, then at his mother, then at me. I have to go, he whispered. But she's okay now, right? The nurse said she's okay. I didn't answer him. I just watched him walk out the door. That was the moment I knew I had to stop being supportive of his pride. If I didn't break him now, he would be broken by a funeral invitation before the year was out. I went home that night, and I didn't go to bed. I sat at the dining room table with my bank statements, my father's will, and a resignation letter I had drafted for him. I was done playing by his rules. If he wouldn't accept my help to save his mother's life and his own sanity, then I would have to force him to choose between his pride and his wife. The front door clicked shut at nearly midnight. I didn't move from the dining room table. I didn't turn on the overhead lights either. I just sat there in the pale, bluish glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, with a stack of papers spread out before me like a map of a life we were no longer living. I heard his heavy footsteps, the slow, dragging gait of a man who was carrying the weight of a multi-million-dollar corporation and a dying mother on his shoulders. He walked into the kitchen, headed straight for the sink to splash water on his face. And then he saw me. He froze. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" he asked, his voice raspy and thin. He didn't sound like a vice president. He sounded like a ghost. "I'm looking at the future," I said quietly. "The one you're so obsessed with protecting." He sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated exhaustion, and dropped his briefcase on the floor. It hit the hardwood with a dull thud that felt like a period at the end of a long, miserable sentence. "Not tonight, please. I just spent 4 hours on a call with the Tokyo team, and then I went back to the nursing home. She was sleeping. I can't do the money argument again." "We aren't arguing about money anymore," I said, standing up and pushing the papers toward his side of the table. "We're talking about time. Look at these." He walked over, squinting in the dim light. I had printed out every bank statement from my inheritance accounts. I had highlighted the interest alone, the money that grew while we slept. I had also printed out a spreadsheet of his mother's medical expenses for the next 5 years, adjusted for the highest level of private care imaginable. "My father didn't just leave me money," I told him, my voice trembling but firm. "He left me a choice. He was a businessman in Shanghai. He knew better than anyone that money is a tool. It's not a trophy. It's not something to be guarded while the people you love suffer. He spent his life building this so that I would never have to choose between a paycheck and a person I love. And yet here you are, making that choice every single day." He looked at the numbers, but I could tell he wasn't really seeing them. His pride was acting like a blindfold. "It's not about the amount. It's about the principle. I am your husband. I am her son. I am supposed to be the one who provides. If I take your father's money to pay for my mother's diapers, what does that make me? It makes you a son who is actually there to hold her hand," I shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. "It makes you a husband who isn't a stranger in his own house. You think you're being a hero. You think you're being the provider? Look at yourself. You're grey. You're shaking. You haven't had a full night's sleep in months. You're providing a bank account for a widow. Because if you keep this up, that's exactly what I'm going to be." He flinched as if I'd physically struck him. He leaned his hands on the table, his head hanging low. I want you to be safe. If anything happens to me, if anything happens to you, I have millions of dollars and a broken heart, I whispered, walking around the table to stand right in front of him. I took his face in my hands. His skin felt like parchment, dry and tight. I don't need the money to be safe. I need you. I need the man who used to rub his mother's feet for 2 hours while telling her stories about Stanford. I need the man who wasn't too busy to notice when her breathing changed. That man is dying, and a vice president is taking his place. I don't want the vice president. I want my husband back. I reached into the stack of papers and pulled out the one I had spent all evening drafting. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a formal resignation letter addressed to his CEO. It was professional, firm, and final. I'm not asking anymore, I said. I'm giving you an ultimatum. You sign this. You quit that job. You go back to a position that allows you to be human again. And you let me pay. You let my father's legacy do what it was meant to do. Support a family in crisis. He looked at the letter, then back at me. I could see the internal war playing out in his eyes. On one side, decades of societal pressure, the man of the house complex, and the fear of being seen as dependent. On the other side, the memory of his mother's face when he wasn't there to feed her. And if I don't? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Then I'm moving out, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I won't stay here and watch you commit slow-motion suicide in the name of protecting me. I won't watch you miss the last year of your mother's life because you're too proud to accept a gift. If you choose the job over your time with her, then you've already chosen a life without me in it. Because I can't be a part of a marriage where pride is more important than presence. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Every tick felt like a second of his mother's life slipping away, a second of our marriage eroding. He stared at that resignation letter like it was a death warrant. But as the minutes passed, his shoulders began to drop. The tension that had held him upright for months started to leak out of him. He sank into the dining chair, covering his face with his hands. And then he started to sob. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the deep, guttural racking of a man who had been holding back a flood for years. He wept for his mother's health, for the stress of the boardrooms, for the guilt of being absent, and for the sheer weight of trying to be everything to everyone while losing himself in the process. I held him. I sat on the floor by his chair and wrapped my arms around his waist, letting him cry into my shoulder until his shirt was damp. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence of the house finally feel like peace instead of loneliness. After a long time, he reached for the pen I had left on the table. His hand was trembling so much he had to steady it with his other one. He didn't look at the bank statements again. He didn't look at the spreadsheets. He just looked at the signature line on the resignation letter. "She's 82, he whispered, more to himself than to me. "She's 82, and I've missed 3 of her dialysis appointments this month." He signed it. The scratch of the pen on the paper sounded like a victory. He pushed the paper away and looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. But for the first time in a year, I saw the man I had married. The VP was gone. The provider complex was cracked. "What now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we go to the nursing home. It's 1 a.m, and the night nurses will think we're crazy. But you're going to sit by her bed, and you're going to rub her hands until the sun comes up. And tomorrow, we're bringing her home. For good." The drive to the nursing home was surreal. At 1:30 in the morning, the city of Silicon Valley looks different. Usually, it's a place of frantic energy, a place where people are constantly grinding toward the next big thing, the next IPO, the next promotion. But at that hour, it was just cold pavement and orange streetlights. My husband sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his hand still trembling slightly in his lap. He hadn't said a word since he signed that resignation letter. I think the shock was finally setting in. He had walked away from a career he'd spent 20 years building. He had walked away from the status, the title, and the 7-figure salary that he thought defined his worth as a man. When we pulled into the parking lot of the private facility, the night was deathly quiet. A single security guard looked at us with a confused expression as we buzzed the front door. The night nurse, a woman named Elena who had known us for years, met us at the desk. Her eyebrows shot up to her hairline. "Is everything okay?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the sterile, tiled hallway. "Did something happen?" "No," my husband said, and his voice sounded stronger than it had all day. "Everything is actually fine for the first time in a long time. I needed to see her." Elena nodded, sensing the weight of the moment, and stepped aside to let us pass. We walked down the long, dimly lit corridor. The only sounds were the soft hum of medical machinery and the occasional distant cough from a room. It's a sound that stays with you, the sound of people waiting. In places like this, time doesn't move forward, it just circles around. When we reached his mother's room, the door was cracked open. The small green light of her pulse oximeter flickered on the wall, casting a rhythmic, ghostly glow over the bed. She looked so small. That's what always struck me, how a woman who had once been the pillar of his life, a woman who had worked 2 jobs to put him through Stanford, could look so fragile under a thin hospital blanket. My husband didn't hesitate this time. He didn't check his phone, he didn't look at his watch. He pulled the plastic chair right up to the side of the bed and sat down. He reached out and took her hand, the left one, which was always colder than the right. He began to rub it, just like he used to, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles over her knuckles. "I'm here, Mom," he whispered into the dark. "I'm not going anywhere." I stood in the doorway and watched them. It felt like I was witnessing a homecoming. After months of being a ghost in her life, a man who visited between meetings and hurried away to catch flights, he was finally back. He stayed like that for hours. I eventually fell asleep in the armchair in the corner, lulled by the steady beep, beep, beep of the monitors. When the sun started to peek through the blinds the next morning, the room was filled with a soft, hazy gold light. His mother was awake. She couldn't speak much. The stroke had taken most of her vocal control, but she was looking right at him. Her eyes were wet, and there was a slight trembling curve to her lips that looked like a smile. She knew. Somehow she knew the shift that had happened. By 10 a.m., the real world tried to claw its way back in. My husband's phone started blowing up. The CEO, the board members, the HR department, they were all calling. His phone sat on the bedside table, vibrating so hard it nearly danced off the edge. I watched him look at it. I saw the old instinct flare up in his eyes, the need to answer, to fix, to manage. "Do you want me to take it?" I asked. He looked at the phone, then at his mother, who was watching the device with a look of quiet anxiety. He picked it up, and for a second I thought he was going to cave. I thought the pressure of that VP title was going to pull him back in. Instead, he turned it off. The screen went black, and the silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. "We're bringing her home today," he said, turning to me. "I don't care what the doctors say about stabilizing her. We have the money now. We'll hire the transport. We'll buy the hospital bed for the living room. We'll hire a private respiratory therapist to come to the house. I'm done with her being in a facility. She's coming home." The next 72 hours were a whirlwind, but it was a productive kind of chaos. For the first time, I felt the true power of the inheritance my father had left me. Before, it was just a number on a screen, something to be saved for a rainy day. But as I started writing checks, that money transformed into something tangible. It bought a state-of-the-art Hoyer lift so my husband wouldn't blow out his back lifting her. It bought a specialized airflow mattress to prevent the bed sores we'd been terrified of. It bought a van with a ramp and a docking system. It bought freedom. We moved her into the sunroom of our house, the brightest room, with windows that looked out over the garden. My husband spent the entire weekend setting it up. He was meticulous. He positioned the bed so she could see the bird feeder outside. He set up a sound system to play the old Chinese folk songs she loved. He wasn't a vice president of engineering anymore. He was a son building a sanctuary. But the transition wasn't without its growing pains. About a week after he quit, the detox started. My husband had been running on adrenaline and corporate stress for so long that when it stopped, he crashed. He'd wake up in a panic at 7 a.m. looking for his laptop before realizing he didn't have anywhere to be. He'd wander the house looking lost, his identity as a high-powered executive stripped away, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. I remember finding him in the kitchen one afternoon, staring at a box of medical supplies. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of doubt. "What if I made a mistake?" he whispered. "The medical bills are already starting to come in for the home equipment. It's tens of thousands of dollars, honey. Your father's money. It's going to disappear so fast. What if something happens to me and I've spent your future on this?" "Then we'll have spent it on a life well lived," I told him, putting my arms around him. "Stop looking at the bank account as a safety net. Start looking at it as a bridge. It's the bridge that's bringing you back to your family." My father was a businessman, yes, but he loved me. He didn't want me to have a safe life if it was a lonely one. He'd be proud of us. He still struggled with the pride of it, though. Every time a nurse arrived, a private nurse I was paying for out of my inheritance, he'd look a little bit smaller. He felt like he was failing as a provider. It's a deep-seated thing in some men, that idea that if they aren't the one signing the checks, they aren't the one in charge. But then, he'd go into the sunroom. He'd see his mother, her skin looking pinker and healthier already, her eyes tracking him as he walked across the room. He'd spend 2 hours rubbing her hands, talking to her about things that actually mattered, memories from his childhood, stories about his father, dreams he had for our own future. The bickering stopped. The coldness in our marriage thawed. We were no longer fighting over a bank account. We were partners in a very difficult, very beautiful mission. We were giving an 82-year-old woman the most dignified, loving end of life possible. But as the weeks turned into months, a new challenge emerged. His mother's health, while stable for a moment, began the inevitable decline that comes with 82 years and a broken spine. And as the reality of her mortality set in, my husband had to face a question he hadn't prepared for. What happens when the work of being a son is finally over? The first few weeks after the resignation were a strange, quiet blur. For years, my husband's phone had been a living thing, a restless animal that buzzed and chirped with the demands of a global corporation. Now it just sat on the kitchen counter, dark and silent. I'd catch him looking at it sometimes, his fingers twitching with the ghost of a habit, expecting a crisis that only he could solve. It's a terrifying thing for a man who has built his entire identity on being the fixer, the provider, the VP, to suddenly just be a man. A man in a quiet house, wearing a t-shirt instead of a tailored suit, listening to the soft hum of his mother's oxygen concentrator in the next room. He went through a period of profound restlessness. He'd spend hours organizing the medical supplies in the sunroom, labeling every box of gauze, every bottle of saline, every specialized feeding tube with a precision that was borderline obsessive. He was trying to apply engineering logic to a situation that was governed by the messy, unpredictable laws of biology and aging. He wanted to optimize his mother's care. He'd create spreadsheets of her vitals, tracking her blood pressure and oxygen levels with the same intensity he used to track quarterly earnings. I let him do it. I knew he needed a mission. He needed to feel like he was still working, even if the company was now just a 3-person household, and the product was dignity. But the real challenge wasn't the logistics. It was the ego. Every Monday morning, a private nurse named Sarah would arrive. She was part of the specialized home care team I had hired. She was brilliant, kind, and incredibly expensive. Every time I handed Sarah her check at the end of the week, I could feel my husband's eyes on me. I could see the shadow cross his face, that old, stubborn pride that told him he should be the one paying. He should be the one signing the checks. "She's doing a great job," he said one evening, watching Sarah deftly adjust his mother's position to prevent a pressure sore. "But I could learn to do that. I could do the overnight shifts too. We don't need to be spending your father's money on a full-time staff." I sat him down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had signed his resignation letter weeks before. "Honey, look at me. You can do it. You've proven for 4.5 years that you can do it all. But just because you can doesn't mean you should. If you spend 18 hours a day doing the physical labor of nursing, you'll be too exhausted to do the emotional labor of being a son. Sarah is here so that you can sit with your mum and just be with her, talk to her, listen to her. That's something no nurse can do. That's the one job that isn't for sale." It took a long time for that to sink in. He had spent so long equating providing with working that he'd forgotten that the most valuable thing he could provide was his presence. Eventually, the spreadsheets stopped. The obsessive labeling of gauze boxes faded. He started spending more time just sitting in the sunroom, the sun casting long, golden rectangles across the floor. He'd read to her, sometimes the news, sometimes old Chinese poetry my father had gifted us, sometimes just technical journals that he knew she didn't understand but loved the sound of his voice explaining. And his mother, she changed. In the nursing home, she had become a patient. She was a set of symptoms, a room number, a schedule of meds. But at home, she became a person again. She was Ma. She was the woman who loved the smell of jasmine tea, even if she could only take a tiny sip through a straw. She was the woman who would watch the birds at the feeder for hours, her eyes lighting up whenever a cardinal landed. We started to have family dinners again. We'd move her wheelchair to the head of the table. She couldn't eat the food we ate, but she was there. We'd talk about our day, we'd laugh, we'd recount old stories. The house felt full again. The money from my inheritance wasn't just paying for medical equipment. It was paying for the atmosphere of a home. It was paying for the ability to not be afraid of the what-ifs. But the reality of 82 is that the what-ifs are always lurking in the shadows. About 3 months into our new routine, her health took another dip. It wasn't a crisis, not like the respiratory infection before, but a slow, quiet fading. She was sleeping more, she was eating less. The dialysis treatments, which we now did at home with a private technician, were becoming harder on her heart. One afternoon, the home care doctor came by for a checkup. He spent a long time in the sunroom, then came out to the kitchen where my husband and I were waiting. He didn't have to say it. I could see it in the way he tucked his stethoscope back into his bag. "She's comfortable," the doctor said softly, "but her body is tired. We're moving from maintenance into comfort care. We're looking at weeks, maybe a few months, not years." My husband didn't flinch. He didn't ask about new treatments or experimental surgeries or optimizing the vitals. He just nodded. He looked older, yes, but he also looked incredibly peaceful. The VP would have been looking for a solution, a way to engineer a way out of death. The son just accepted the news with a heavy heart and a clear conscience. "Thank you, doctor," he said. That night, for the first time, he didn't check the bank accounts. He didn't mention the inheritance. He didn't talk about his career or what he was going to do next. He just went into the sunroom, turned off the overhead lights, and sat in the dark with his mother, holding her hand as she slept. I watched him from the doorway, and I realized that the ultimatum I'd given him hadn't just saved our marriage, or her final days. It had saved him from a lifetime of what if I wasn't there. He was finally realizing that providing for someone doesn't mean paying for their survival. It means honoring their life. He stayed in that room until dawn, and for the next few weeks, that became his world. The outside world, the stock market, the tech industry, the Silicon Valley rat race, it all ceased to exist. Our world was the size of a sunroom, filled with the scent of jasmine and the sound of quiet breathing. But as her breath became more shallow and the days grew shorter, a new tension began to rise. Not between us, but within him. He was starting to realize that the end was truly coming, and even with all the money in the world, even with the best doctors and the most expensive equipment, there is one thing that wealth can never buy: another minute. I remember him coming into the bedroom one night, his face pale in the moonlight. "I'm scared," he whispered. "Of what?" I asked. "Of what happens when I'm not the son anymore. I gave up the job. I gave up the title. I'm spending your future. And soon I won't even have her to care for. Who am I going to be then?" It was the question I had been waiting for. The final layer of the VP identity was finally peeling away, leaving the man underneath to figure out who he was without the armor of a career or the mission of a caregiver. The sunroom had become the heart of our home, a quiet sanctuary where time seemed to slow down and stretch. It was strange. The more she faded, the more the house felt alive with a different kind of energy. It wasn't the frantic, electric hum of a high-powered career or the stressed-out vibrations of a man trying to do 2 full-time jobs at once. It was a slow, heavy, beautiful peace. My husband spent those weeks in a state of suspended animation. He had officially finished his transition period at the company, handing over his keys and his passwords, and for the first time in 25 years, he didn't have a single meeting to attend. He was just there. He'd wake up early, not to check the Nikkei or the Nasdaq, but to check the humidity in her room. He'd spend an hour meticulously cleaning her face with warm water and a soft cloth, moving with a gentleness that would have been unrecognizable to his former board of directors. He was no longer the vice president of engineering. He was the curator of her comfort. But that question he'd asked me, who am I going to be then? It hung in the air like a shadow. I watched him grapple with it. Some days he was fine, lost in the rhythm of care. Other days I'd find him staring out the window at the neighbour leaving for work in his suit, and I could see the old life calling to him. It's hard to unlearn decades of hustle. It's hard to realise that your value isn't tied to your output. "You're being a son," I told him one afternoon as we sat on the back deck, the baby monitor between us crackling with the sound of her soft, rhythmic breathing. "That's a full-time job. It's the most important one you'll ever have, but it's a job with an expiration date," he said, his voice thick with a grief he was already mourning. "When it's over, the project is closed. There's no next quarter. There's just a funeral. And then I'm just a guy who spent his wife's inheritance and doesn't have a title anymore." "You'll always have a title," I said, taking his hand. "You're my husband, and you're the man who chose love over ego. That's a title most men never earn." He looked at me, and for the first time I didn't see the flicker of prideful resistance. I saw a man who was finally, painfully starting to believe me. As her health continued to dip, the comfort care became our entire focus. We used the inheritance to bring in the best of the best, not just medical professionals, but people who understood the soul of the transition. We hired a harpist to come twice a week and play softly in the corner of the sunroom. My husband thought it was extravagant at first, another drain on the future fund. But when he saw how his mother's pulse slowed and her face relaxed at the sound of the strings, he stopped counting the cost. We brought in a chef who specialized in liquid nutrition that actually tasted like food. Creamy soups infused with ginger and lemongrass, the flavors of her childhood in China. We weren't just keeping her alive, We were honouring the person she had been. One evening, about 4 months after he'd quit, we were sitting in the sunroom. The harpist had just left, and the house was filled with the scent of jasmine incense. My husband was sitting by her bed, his head resting on the edge of the mattress, his hand tucked into hers. "I remember," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "When I was 10, we didn't have much. She worked at a textile factory, 12-hour shifts. One winter, my boots had holes in them. I didn't tell her because I knew we couldn't afford new ones. I just stuffed them with newspaper." He paused, a small, sad smile tugging at his lips. "She found out. I don't know how. Mums always know. She didn't say anything. She just started working an extra 4 hours every night, cleaning offices after the factory closed. 2 weeks later, I had the best boots in the class. She didn't buy a coat for herself that year. She just wore an old shawl." He looked up at her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. "I spent years thinking that providing meant giving her a nice nursing home and paying the bills. I thought that by being a VP, I was honouring her sacrifice. I thought the money was the point. But sitting here, I realised she didn't work those extra hours for the money. She worked them for the time. She wanted me to have a childhood where I didn't have to worry about my feet being cold. She bought me time to just be a kid." He squeezed her hand gently. "And now, because of you, because of your father, I'm finally returning the favour. I'm buying her time to just be a mother, at peace, in her own home. I was so angry at you for the ultimatum, honey. I was so insulted by the idea of using your money." He looked over at me, his eyes shining with tears. "But I get it now. It was never about the money. It was about the fact that we were rich in the one thing that actually matters, and I was too proud to spend it. Thank you for forcing me to be a son again." That was the moment the last of the Cold War between us vanished. The inheritance was no longer a point of contention. It was a shared blessing. It was the oil in the lamp that was keeping her final days bright. A week later, the end began in earnest. Her kidneys started to fail, and the home care doctor told us it was a matter of days. We didn't panic. We didn't call for an ambulance. We didn't try to engineer a miracle. We gathered in the sunroom. My husband didn't leave her side for 48 hours. He slept on a cot right next to her bed. He talked to her constantly, recounting every memory he had, thanking her for the boots, for the education, for the love. He sang to her. He rubbed her hands with lavender oil. I stayed in the background, keeping the house running, making sure the nurses were fed, and ensuring the environment stayed as peaceful as a temple. I watched my husband transform. The VP would have been a wreck, staring at monitors and demanding data. This man, the son, was a pillar of strength. He was heartbroken, yes, but he was present. He was doing the work he was meant to do. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, with the sound of the water pattering against the glass of the sunroom, she took her last breath. It wasn't a struggle, it wasn't a crisis. It was just a quiet, final exhale, like a candle going out after a long, beautiful evening. My husband didn't scream. He didn't break down into hysterics. He just leaned over, kissed her forehead and whispered, "Go home, Ma. I've got it from here." He sat with her for an hour after she passed. Just him and his mother, in the silence of the room he had built for her. When he finally came out, he looked older, but he also looked like he'd had a weight lifted off his chest that he'd been carrying since he was 10 years old. The funeral was small, but elegant. We used the inheritance to ensure everything was perfect. The flowers, the music, the tribute to her life. Many of his former colleagues from the engineering world came. They looked at him with a mix of confusion and pity. They saw a man who had thrown away his career at the peak of his powers. They didn't understand, but as I stood by his side, watching him greet every guest with a genuine, peaceful smile, I knew he didn't care what they thought. He wasn't looking for their approval anymore. He didn't need a title to know who he was. But as the house went quiet after the funeral, and the medical equipment was hauled away, and the sunroom was just a room again, the big question returned. The what now loomed over us. We had the money, we had the time, but we no longer had the mission. And for a man like my husband, that silence can be the most dangerous thing of all. The week after the funeral was the quietest week of my life. There is a specific kind of silence that settles into a house after a long-term illness ends. It's not just the absence of noise, it's the absence of effort. For 4.5 years, every breath in our home had been an effort. Every movement, every meal, every heartbeat had been something we worked for. And then, suddenly, there was nothing to work for. The medical supply company came on Wednesday to take away the hospital bed, the oxygen concentrator, and the lift. Watching them wheel that bed out of the sunroom felt like watching a part of our history being erased. My husband stood in the driveway, hands in his pockets, watching the truck pull away. He didn't look sad, he looked hollowed out. Not in a bad way, but like a building that had been gutted and was waiting to be rebuilt into something else. "It's weird, isn't it?" he said, as we walked back inside. "The sunroom is just a room again. I keep expecting to hear the alarm on her feeding pump. I keep checking my watch to see if it's time to rub her hands." "It'll take time," I told him. "You've been a soldier on the front lines for a long time. You can't just walk off the battlefield and expect your ears to stop ringing." For the first few days, he wandered. He'd go into his home office, sit at his desk, look at his blank monitors, and then stand up and leave. He'd go into the kitchen, start to make a smoothie, and then remember he didn't need to blend anything anymore. He was a man without a country. He was 48 years old, a Stanford-educated engineer with millions of dollars in the bank thanks to my father, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with his Tuesday afternoon. Then the real world came knocking again. On Friday, his old CEO called. I heard the phone buzzing on the counter and saw my husband hesitate before picking it up. He took the call in the garden. I watched through the window as he paced back and forth, the old executive posture returning, shoulders back, head tilted, listening intently. When he came back inside, he looked conflicted. "They want me back," he said. "Not as VP of Engineering this time. They want to create a new role, Chief Technology Officer. More money, more stock options, and they said I can set my own hours. They're desperate, honey. Apparently, the department has been a disaster since I left." I felt a pang of fear in my chest. Was this it? Was he going back into the meat grinder? Was the provider in him going to win out again? "What did you tell them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. He looked around the kitchen, then out toward the sunroom, which was now filled with nothing but light and a few empty plant stands. I told them I'd think about it, but it felt wrong. Listening to him talk about market share and disruptive tech and Q4 targets, it felt like he was speaking a language I used to know but don't care about anymore. After holding my mother's hand while she died, I don't really care about the next generation of semiconductors. He sat down at the table and looked at me. But I also can't just sit here. I'm an engineer. I'm a builder. If I'm not building something, I'll lose my mind. That was the moment I realized that my inheritance hadn't just bought us time with his mother. It had bought him the freedom to find a new soul. "So don't build semiconductors," I said. "Build something that matters. You spent 4 years dealing with medical equipment that was clunky, expensive, and difficult to use. You spent years navigating a healthcare system that treats 82-year-olds like they're already gone. Use that Stanford brain for something that would make your mom proud." It was like a light bulb went off behind his eyes. The VP look vanished, replaced by the engineer look, the one where he's solving a puzzle. Over the next few weeks, the dining room table was covered in papers again. But this time, they weren't bank statements or resignation letters. They were sketches, blueprints, business plans. He started reaching out to his old contacts, but not for a job. He was looking for partners. He decided to start a non-profit foundation, funded initially by a portion of my inheritance, dedicated to developing affordable, high-tech home care solutions for paralyzed seniors. He wanted to design better lifts, better sensors, and better communication tools for people who couldn't speak. He wanted to take the engineering he was so good at and apply it to the caregiving he had learned in the trenches. "I'm going to call it the Jasmine Project," he told me one night, referring to his mother's favorite tea. "And I'm not doing it for the salary. I'm doing it because I know what it's like to be a son who's drowning. I want to give other families the tools to stay together at home, without it costing them their lives." I watched him dive into this new mission with a passion I'd never seen during his corporate days. He was working hard, yes, but it was different. He wasn't stressed, he was inspired. He wasn't providing for a future I didn't want. He was building a legacy for a mother he loved. One afternoon, a few months later, we were sitting in the sunroom. We turned it into a library lounge area, a place for us to read and talk. The ghost of the hospital bed was gone, replaced by a sense of quiet accomplishment. He looked over at me and said, "You know, if you hadn't given me that ultimatum, I would have been in a boardroom when she died. I would have made an extra $500,000 that year, and I would have spent the rest of my life trying to buy back the memory of her last breath. I was so wrong about the money, honey. I was so wrong about what it meant to be a man." "It's okay," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder. "My father would have loved this. He didn't want his money to stay in Shanghai. He wanted it to do exactly what it's doing now, giving us a life that's actually worth living." We've since poured a significant part of the inheritance into the Jasmine Project. It's growing. They've already patented a new type of circulation-assisting sleeve for bed-bound patients that's 10 times cheaper than the current models. My husband doesn't take a salary. He doesn't have a corner office. But he has his spark back. He's still the provider. But now he's providing hope. He's providing dignity. And most importantly, he's providing himself. To me, and to the memory of the woman who worked extra shifts at a textile factory so he could have boots without holes. Looking back, I realized that the hardest part of the whole journey wasn't the caregiving or the medical bills. It was the battle of the ego. It was the moment we had to decide if we were going to live for a bank account or live for each other. I think about the people out there right now, stuck in that same cycle. People who think that working for the future is more important than being in the present. I want to tell them, the future is a ghost. It doesn't exist yet. All you have is the person sitting in front of you, the parent who's getting older, the spouse who's waiting for you to come home. Don't wait for an inheritance or a crisis to make that choice. Don't wait until the sunroom is empty to realize what you should have been doing in it. Money can always be made again. Your father's legacy, your degrees, your career, they aren't going anywhere. But you only have one life. You only have one family. If you were in my shoes, would you have pushed as hard as I did? Would you have given your husband an ultimatum to save him from himself? Or would you have let him keep working to protect your future? It's a hard question, but I think the answer is found in the moments we spent in that sunroom, in the silence and the jasmine-scented air. Let me know in the comments what you think. Have you ever had to choose between a career and a loved one? How did you handle the guilt or the pride? If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe for more real-life accounts of love, sacrifice, and the things that truly matter. Because at the end of the day, when the medical equipment is gone and the office is empty, all we have left is the love we gave and the time we spent.